1954, West Berlin. Inside an unremarkable warehouse near the edge of the city, a small group of British and American engineers are hunched over a table covered in maps. Red lines snake beneath streets and buildings, tracing something no one walking above would ever notice. Below the divided city, a tunnel is about to be built. Not for transport, not for escape, for interception. The objective is simple on paper. Reach a cluster of Soviet military communication cables buried beneath East Berlin and tap them, quietly, without a single sign anything had been touched. If it worked, the West would have direct access to the internal conversations of the Red Army in Germany. Not stolen documents, not secondhand reports, the actual voice communications of Soviet military command, in real time. The operation is classified at the highest level, the kind of secret where the fewer people who know, the better. But this operation is not as private as they believe. To understand why this tunnel was built, you have to look at Berlin in the early 1950s. After World War II, Germany had been carved up between the four Allied powers: America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, sitting deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, was itself divided into four sectors. And while the Western Allies were slowly rebuilding their zones into something resembling a functioning democratic society, the Soviets were doing the opposite. They were locking things down, tightening control, consolidating power, and expanding internal security structures. But here's the thing about Berlin that made it uniquely dangerous and uniquely valuable at the same time. People could still move between East and West. The full physical barrier, the wall, wouldn't come until 1961. In the early 50s, Berlin was a porous, chaotic, electric city. Spies from every nation walked the same streets. Defectors slipped between checkpoints. Information moved in ways it couldn't anywhere else. For the CIA and MI6, Berlin was the front line of the intelligence war, and the front line was where they needed to be listening. The problem was, they weren't hearing nearly enough. Soviet military communications were increasingly being routed through buried landlines, not radio signals. Radio could be intercepted from a safe distance. Landlines? You had to physically get to the cable, and the cables they cared about most were running through the Soviet sector of Berlin. Someone, at some point, proposed an idea that most would have dismissed immediately. What if we just dug under them? The man who turned that idea into a formal proposal was a CIA officer named William Harvey. Harvey did not look like a conventional intelligence officer. He was overweight, drank heavily, carried a pistol almost everywhere, even to diplomatic functions, and had an unshakable confidence in his own judgment. He was abrasive, difficult, and exceptionally capable. In Berlin, those qualities were not liabilities, they were assets. Since becoming the CIA's Berlin base chief in 1952, Harvey had developed an intense focus on Soviet military communications. He understood exactly what digging beneath Soviet-controlled territory would mean. If exposed, it could trigger an international crisis of enormous scale. He understood the risks and chose to proceed anyway. MI6 had been thinking along similar lines. A British signals intelligence officer named Peter Lunn had previously participated in a smaller tunneling operation in Vienna, where British agents successfully tapped Soviet cables beneath the city. It was limited in scope, but it proved something important. It could be done. Lunn brought that experience to Berlin. When the CIA and MI6 sat down together, the idea stopped being reckless speculation. It became a coordinated operation. The Americans called it Operation Gold. The British called it Operation Stopwatch. The objective was precise: tap into 3 buried Soviet communication cables running through the Alt-Glienecki district, near the border between the American and Soviet sectors. Those cables carried communications between Soviet military headquarters and their forces across East Germany. If they gained access, they would not be listening to routine chatter. They would be hearing strategic planning, order of battle discussions, personnel assignments, real operational decisions, the kind of intelligence that usually required years of penetration and enormous risk to obtain. The tunnel would need to extend approximately 450 meters, nearly 1,476 feet. It would require engineers, diggers, signal specialists, security teams, and a cover story strong enough to explain why American personnel were moving in and out of a warehouse at night for months. They gave themselves 18 months. They began digging in the fall of 1954. The cover story was elegant. The warehouse, officially designated as a U.S. Army radar station, was constructed first, directly along the border. No one questioned it. Radar installations were a common and unremarkable presence in divided Berlin. The structure was legitimate, the radar equipment was operational, the The personnel moving in and out were uniformed American soldiers performing visible, routine duties. Beneath the warehouse floor, however, a second operation was underway. The excavation was an engineering challenge. Berlin's soil was soft and unstable, not solid rock. The tunnel required reinforcement to prevent collapse. It needed climate control to prevent condensation from damaging sensitive equipment. It had to remain quiet enough that Soviet patrols walking above would detect nothing. And the excavated earth, hundreds of tons, had to disappear without drawing attention. The soil was packed into bags and removed gradually at night, blended into routine base transport activity. Noise was minimized through careful structural design and by timing excavation around Soviet patrol patterns. Structural stability was achieved by constructing a reinforced, steel-lined tube beneath the surface, complete with lighting, ventilation, and a narrow rail system to move equipment and supplies. At its height, more than 50 personnel were involved in the operation. They worked in shifts. Discussion of the project outside secure areas was strictly prohibited. Physical security around the warehouse was extensive and tightly controlled. By February 1955, the tunnel was complete. The tapping equipment was installed. Recording systems were activated. The operation went live. For the next 11 months and 11 days, CIA and MI6 personnel inside that warehouse monitored Soviet military communications in real time. Approximately 443,000 reels of magnetic tape were recorded. The volume of intelligence collected required years of analysis. By scale and output, it became one of the most significant signals intelligence operations conducted by Western services against the Soviet Union. And then, it ended. On the night of April 21, 1956, Soviet and East German troops arrived at the site above the tunnel. They dug down. They found it. The operation was over. Within hours, Soviet state media began broadcasting images of the exposed tunnel. Foreign journalists were escorted through the site. The discovery was presented as proof of an illegal Western intrusion into Soviet-controlled territory, evidence of covert activity beneath East Berlin. Western officials neither confirmed nor denied the operation. Public statements were minimal. Internally, there was a scramble to understand what had gone wrong. The official explanation was straightforward. The tunnel, it was said, had been uncovered during routine maintenance work or through effective Soviet counterintelligence, a fortunate discovery. That wasn't what happened. This is where the official story begins to unravel. The Soviets had not discovered the tunnel through luck or skill. They had known about it before a single shovel of dirt was turned. In January 1954, before construction even began, a joint CIA-MI6 planning conference was held in London. The full operational details were shared with a small group of senior officers. One of the British officers present was George Blake. Blake was a senior MI6 officer with an established record of service. He was considered reliable and experienced. He had survived years as a prisoner of war in Korea. He was also a Soviet agent. Blake had been recruited by the KGB during his captivity. Whether through ideological conviction or coercion remains debated. By the time he attended the London conference, he was reporting everything he learned directly to Moscow. Within weeks, KGB chief Ivan Serov was briefing a small circle of senior Soviet officials on the tunnel's existence. The operation had been compromised before construction even began. So why did the Soviets wait? Why allow the tunnel to operate for nearly a year? The reasoning was strategic. Exposing the tunnel immediately would have exposed Blake. Knowledge of the operation before construction began could only have come from someone inside the planning conference. Blake was far too valuable to sacrifice for a single tunnel. The KGB made a calculated decision. They allowed the tunnel to operate. They permitted non-critical information to pass through the tapped cables while diverting sensitive communications elsewhere. The intelligence value was managed carefully without raising suspicion. For 11 months, the CIA and MI6 believed they were collecting extraordinary intelligence. What they were receiving was a controlled stream of information designed to protect a source considered more valuable than the tunnel itself. It was a disciplined and highly effective counterintelligence strategy. The exposure of the tunnel did not immediately lead to the identification of George Blake. He continued working for MI6 for another 5 years. He was formally identified in 1961, not through any connection to the Berlin Tunnel, but after a Polish intelligence officer defected to the West and provided information indicating the existence of a Soviet mole inside MI6. Blake was arrested, interrogated, and eventually confessed. His trial was conducted partly in secret. During sentencing, the judge noted that the full extent of the damage caused by his actions was difficult to measure. Blake had supplied the Soviet Union with information concerning hundreds of Western agents operating behind the Iron Curtain. The precise number of those who were imprisoned or executed as a result was never conclusively established. He was sentenced to 42 years in prison, the longest sentence imposed by a British court at that time. He served 5. In 1966, Blake escaped from Wormwood Scrubs prison, with assistance from a small group of civilian sympathizers he had met while incarcerated. After scaling the prison wall, he was concealed in London for several weeks, before being transported out of the United Kingdom in a camper van. He eventually reached Moscow, where he was granted asylum and lived for the remainder of his life. Blake died in 2020 at the age of 98. He never expressed regret for his actions. The legacy of Operation Gold is more complex than it first appears. Depending on perspective, it can be viewed either as a story of technical ambition and significant engineering achievement, or as an example of how even highly sophisticated intelligence operations can be undermined by a single compromised source. Both realities existed at the same time. The tunnel itself was a genuine achievement, the engineering was real, the effort was substantial. The people who built and operated it believed the mission carried operational risk and strategic importance. Many of them were justified in that assessment. However, the intelligence collected through the tunnel was compromised from the beginning, shaped in part by an adversary who had prior knowledge of the operation. The Soviets had effectively transformed a technically advanced intelligence project into a managed channel of information, influencing what Western analysts were able to hear while protecting their most valuable source. The operation raises a structural question that intelligence agencies continue to confront. How can information be evaluated with confidence when the possibility of manipulation cannot be excluded? The Cold War contained many operations that appeared successful but later proved more complex. The tunnel remains a particularly clear example because of its scale and the presence of internal compromise. Every reel of tape, every analyst who processed recordings, every official who reviewed intelligence reports, all of it was shaped by conditions that had been quietly influenced before the operation began. At the same time, the tunnel was not without measurable value. Not all communications were controlled. The volume of recordings, 443,000 reels, made total management unlikely. Subsequent historical assessments suggest that meaningful intelligence did emerge from the operation. It did not, however, produce the full strategic value it might have achieved in the absence of internal compromise. The Berlin Tunnel still exists in a way. In the 1990s, after German reunification, it was excavated and opened as a kind of historical site. You can look at photographs of the steel-lined corridor, the now rusted equipment, the cramped space where signals officers once sat in the dark listening to the communications of their adversaries. It looks smaller than you'd expect. Most places of enormous historical significance do. 11 months of operation, one betrayal that predated all of it. The Cold War was fought in shadows, and the Berlin Tunnel is one of those shadows made briefly visible. A reminder that intelligence work is not just about what you know, but about whether what you know is actually true. And in the story of Operation Gold, the most important truth was the one nobody on the Western side knew at all.